I'll give you a quick introduction to Professor Andoh, and what we'll do then is, well, I'll very quickly tell you how it's going to run. So the professor is going to talk for, I think, about 20-30 minutes, and then afterwards we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. I'll tell you how that will work once we get to that stage. But yeah, if you have any questions or please wait until that question and answer section, just to make things as smooth as possible. Okay, so just to introduce Professor Andoh, he's originally from Ghana, and he went to university there, studied for a BA in economics and law at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and then moved on to the United States, where he did some graduate work at Virginia State and NYU. And he also did some research in Azerbaijan, interestingly. And these days he is a professor of economics at the Southern Connecticut State University. So, Professor, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. I am delighted for the invitation, and I thank Dr. Gabriel for extending to me the invitation to come and talk to you this afternoon. I thought we would begin in a rather informal way. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, and then hopefully, as I'm talking about myself, you get a little bit a sense of how I'm sorry, I think I was on mute. I was born in Ghana many years ago and went to school there, both elementary and university. In those days, our school system actually followed pretty much the system we inherited from the British. We had an elementary school of about 8 years. I went to secondary school for about 7 years, and then went to the University of Science and Technology. It was a very competitive system. Whilst everybody went to the elementary school, the movement from elementary school to secondary school was rather very rigorous. We had what was known as a common entrance, and because there were not a lot of secondary schools or high schools, very few people moved on from elementary school to high school. And then when I was in high school, there were not as many universities as there are today. In fact, back then, there were only 3 universities for the whole country of about 10 or 12 million people and hundreds of thousands of secondary school students. So it was very, very difficult to get to the university. And as a result, not a lot of people were able to go to the university. I did well enough to go to the university, got a degree in economics and law. And back then, if you did well enough, got first class or second class upper, the university judged you to be good academic material and sent you overseas to get a graduate education with a hope that you would come back and be part of the faculty. Fortunately or unfortunately, I got my PhD and decided that I'd rather stay in the United States. I got my PhD in economics from NYU, and I have been teaching at Southern Connecticut State University now for about 33 years. That's a very long time. During that period, I've risen to be professor. I chaired the department. I have been dean of the school, and have also been director of the MBA program, which I helped to develop. Now, today's topic is a very interesting one because it's one which is dear to me: education and economic development. There is not one person who will disagree with the fact that education is extremely important for economic development. Now, intuitively, you can see the link. If you have an educated population, you would have a higher output because that population will be more educated. It is easier for them to learn new things, and as a result, their productivity will increase. Now, when you look at the data on economic development or growth and education, however, sometimes it's very difficult to determine whether the causation runs from education to growth, or rather it runs from growth to development. In other words, does more education lead to faster growth, or faster growth leads to the provision of more education? About 10 or 12 years ago, in a discussion with some friends about the poor performance of Ghanaian students on the program for international student assessment, I decided to look at the data of the 76 countries that took the exam in 2012. Now, what I found from the data was that the correlation between the PISA score of the 76 countries that took the test that year and their per capita GDP was negative, which essentially means that the countries with a higher per capita GDPs actually didn't do as well on the PISA score as one would have expected. Now, that wasn't the end of the story. Now, notwithstanding the negative correlation for the 76 countries, however, when you divided them into 3 tiers, what you discover is that the first third had an average per capita GDP of $43,000. Basically, these are the developed countries. The second tier had an average per capita GDP of $20,000, which will be the middle, upper level income countries. And the third had an average per capita GDP of $13,000 or less. Basically, what this showed that the more developed countries did better on the PISA scores than the less developed countries. And one could then infer that the higher GDPs go with the better performance on the PISA scores, or higher PISA scores go with higher GDP. By the way, my native Ghana had the lowest per capita GDP of all the 76 countries in the sample, and it placed last. Hence, the title of the piece back then was Ghana Comes Last. And it came last, I felt, and a lot of people felt, because the students didn't do well. They didn't do well because they didn't have the resources to do well. And of course, the conclusion then is that if the countries had resources to provide good education system, the students would have done very well in the PISA score. Or was it the other way around? Now, the idea that education promotes economic growth is, as I said, very simple, and economists are now generally accepted as an article of truth. Now, Robert Barrow, in 1991, in an article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, he found a positive relationship between education and economic growth. And each additional year of school, actually, he found increases per capita GDP by 0.3%. You may think that 0.3% is not a whole deal, but it's a big deal. The cumulative effect of a 0.3% increase in GDP means that in a short period of time, GDP will be quite large. Xavier Salahi-Martin also concludes that it is not education per se which matters, but the institutions that accompany the provision of economic for education, and that without the proper institutions, education does not impact GDP that much. There's a very interesting book I read by a Cambridge economist called Chang. He wrote this book in 2011. The 23 things they don't tell you about in capitalism. In that book, what he called thing 17, he argues that more education is not going to make a country richer. And his argument says that what matters really in the determination of national prosperity is not the educational levels of individuals, but the nation's ability to organize individuals into enterprises with higher productivity. In that book, Chan cites Lang Pritchard in Where Has All the Education Gone? This was a World Bank Economic Review article. Now, in that article, Pritchard analyzed data from dozens of rich and developing countries during the 1960 to 1987 period. And his conclusions are very interesting. he found very little evidence to support the view that increased education leads to higher economic growth. Now, he also concluded that the developmental impact of education varied widely across countries, and that it has fallen short of expectations for three possible reasons. First, the governance environment could have been sufficiently perverse that the accumulation of educated capital actually lowered economic growth. Basically, education alone is not enough. Education needs some complementary factors. Secondly, he says that the marginal returns to education could have fallen partly as a result of a rapid increase in education itself. Basically, that education suffers from diminishing marginal returns as any factor of production. And third, that the educational quality could have been so low that years of schooling created no human capital. And the extent and mix of these three phenomena vary from country to country in explaining the actual impact of education or the lack of it. Now, this would suggest that we need to be careful when we talk about education as a very important factor in determining economic growth. It may be so, but it is not very clear. The general consensus, however, is that education is so good. Whereas a long time ago, Adam Smith had argued that educated people are more responsible citizens, and every country needs responsible citizens. Higher levels of education enhances learning by doing. And when you are doing a high level of research, you need a highly educated population. The time that can only be provided by having lots of universities with people having access to it. Now, the World Bank says that education delivers large, consistent returns in terms of income and is the most important factor to ensure equality of opportunities. For individuals, education promotes employment, earnings, health, and it reduces poverty. Globally, there is a 9% increase in hourly earnings for one extra year of schooling. Now, this is where some of the problems come from. Is the relationship linear or something else? Because if it's linear, then the more schooling you do, the higher the earnings you are going to get. But if education suffers from diminishing marginal returns, then it would suggest that there is only so much of it that can lead to the optimal impact on the gross domestic product. Making smart and efficient investment in people's education is critical for the development of human capital, which is how economists now see education. Education is seen as an investment in individuals, and therefore it is capital. There are different perspectives on the role of education. Now, some say it increases productivity. In some of the developing countries, however, it is not easy to see that some of the education that is being given is more for credentialing or signaling, and that it does not lead to productivity or it does not increase the human capital that is in labor. Essentially, higher levels of schooling are associated with earnings, not because they directly raise productivity, but because they certify that the worker is likely to be productive. When you have a lot of people vying for the same job, employers need a means to determine which one of the many people applying for the job they should hire. And in the absence of the ability to observe the important traits that will lead to having a good employee, you look at the schooling. Essentially, it's almost as if we are raising our hands and I want my hand raised higher so I can be selected. Now, this type of education which is simply for credentialing, signaling, does not actually lead to increased productivity. You have situations where college graduates are either unemployed or doing jobs which could have been done by high school students. Now, if an individual is paying to have the education by himself, that's okay. But if society is allocating resources for education simply so that people can signal that they are qualified to be clerks in the bank or to occupy positions that does not require college education, then one could argue that the society is actually wasting the resources. And I'm afraid in many of the developing countries, including my own Ghana, we see evidence that that is what is happening. The expenditure on tertiary education is very high compared to the primary and secondary. And it is difficult to argue that the returns from the higher education actually merits the expenditure being made. Education actually may also be for just rationing. There are simply not enough jobs. So the highly educated ones who are going to get a job. So everybody wants to get education. And especially when there are not enough vacancies in the universities or when there are not enough jobs in the economy. And the more education you get, the more likely you are to get the job. And the education is simply acting as a means of rationing those who have access to the job. Now, for public policy reasons, it is important to distinguish among these competing views. Education imparts skills that enhance productivity. Increasing in earnings are due to the increased productivity brought about by investment in education. The screen hypothesis is that employers select workers with higher qualifications to reduce their risk of hiring someone with a lower capacity to learn. As we said, that's not how society wants to allocate resources. Now, let's talk a little bit about the rate of return on education. Essentially, the rate of return looks at the summary of the costs and benefits of investment incurred at different points in time, expressed as an annual percentage. Now, education is the transmission of knowledge, teaching, learning by doing, and training. Now, these activities we are seeing make workers productive. And conceptually, it is not different from investment, which we think of typically when we talk about fiscal capital. Output, or the gross domestic product, depends on the capital which the society has and labor. And capital is the result of investment. So we can invest in capital, increase the capital stock, invest in labor, increase the human capital. And when we increase capital or labor, in this case, capital is K, L is labor, an increase in the capital stock will be the same as an increase in the labor stock. And an increase in labor stock is equivalent to investing in humans so that they become more productive. Now, the cost of education can be broken into two, the private cost and then the social cost. If you are in school, you are not working, and the wages you could have earned in the developing countries, it could be the work you could have done on the farm, that represents an opportunity cost. If you are in school, you are not working on the farm. The books, the tuition, the transportation to and from school, all of these are private costs which have to be borne by the individual. So if you are going to invest in education, you want to make sure that the returns will cover these costs. There is also the social cost. In many countries, education is provided for by the government. The buildings, the income of teachers, subsidies to students, and all the infrastructure needed to provide education will be provided by the government. And these will be social costs. It will be the taxpayers who pay for this. So the total cost of education is not just the private cost, which the individual bears, but also the social cost. Now, the empirical evidence on the returns show that the private rates of return are greater than social rates of return. And this is across all income levels and regional classifications. Lower income countries tend to have higher rates of return, both private and social, on education than high income countries. Now, previous work shows that returns are highest also for primary education, for general curriculum, education on women, and for countries with lower per capita income. Now, primary education shows the highest social profitability in all regions of the world. Social and private returns at all levels generally decline by the level of a country's per capita income. In other words, as the per capita income goes up, the social and private returns get smaller. Overall, the returns to female education are higher than those to male education. The return to the academic secondary school track are higher than the vocational track. Now, this is data which I put together, and it summarizes very neatly the discussions we have and the policy implications from it. You can see the regions segregated into low income, lower middle, upper middle, and high income countries. Now, if you look at the average estimated rates of return to education, you can see that on the social returns, the returns to higher education, for example, in the low income countries, is only 10%. In the high school or secondary schools, it's 15.2%. In the primary, however, it is 22.4%. So if people have primary education, the return, social rate of return is much higher than secondary schools or tertiary schools. If you are a policymaker in a developing country and you are making a decision to invest in education to increase the gross domestic product, the social rate of return, of course, is what matters the most. You would expect that government would put more into primary education and not as much into secondary education, and even less on higher education. And actually, this is true no matter what the income level is. Now, if you look at the private returns, the story is even more starker. Primary education, the returns is 25.2, secondary education is 19, and higher tertiary education is 25. Now, so you would again expect that individuals and the government would invest more in primary education. Unfortunately, in a lot of the developing countries, it is not the case. There's a tendency for governments actually to invest more. In fact, the cost of educating people at the university level tends to be much higher, and governments, for reasons of prestige or maybe pressure put upon the government by people who have already gone through the process, the government tends to spend a lot more on university education than on primary and secondary, even though the data suggests very strongly that the primary education has the biggest return in its impact on the gross domestic product. So, for the economy, there's no doubt that education for signaling or rationing purposes is not a good reason for providing education. Society benefits if the social rate of return is greater than the private rate of return. And if returns on primary education is greater than on secondary and tertiary education, then society should spend more on primary education and less on secondary and tertiary. As I said earlier, unfortunately, in many poor countries, such as where I come from, governments spend more per person on tertiary education than on primary or secondary. And because of the positive and high private rates of return, the demand for secondary and tertiary education is very high. And unfortunately, governments accede to this by providing more of it. Now, if the additional years of education are for signaling or for rationing purposes, then one could argue that individuals should pay for the additional years of education. It should not be the government who pays for the structures and the teachers and all the educational equipment needed. In fact, if the private rates are returned, there's a good argument for suggesting or telling individuals who seek it to pay for it. In many countries, or in many of the poor countries now, the developing countries, especially in Ghana, which I'm most familiar with, it looks as if the private sector is stepping up. Whereas 20 or 30 years ago, all the universities in Ghana were owned by the government, you know, the University of Ghana, University of Science and Technology, and Cape Coast University. Today, even as government universities, the number has gone up. The private universities have also gone up quite considerably. In fact, there are now more private universities in Ghana than public government-owned universities. Whether this is good or bad, I don't know. One thing I can observe is that the country used to have institutions called the polytechnics. The polytechnics were actually tertiary institutions. This was, back then, it was for students who did not do well enough to go to the universities, but had skills which could, steer them towards what we call technical and vocational skills. These are the places you went to learn how to be a plumber, auto mechanic, and so on and so forth. In recent times, the government has converted all of these into universities, just like the first three, and they offer bachelors in, bachelor's degrees. Unfortunately, as a result of them all becoming universities, all of them have sought to attract as many people as possible. And instead of offering the technical disciplines, now all of them offer bachelor degrees in business administration, and now enroll a lot more students in business administration than in the mechanical engineering, carpentry, and so on and so forth. I have argued that this represents a misallocation of resources to the extent that the government is supporting them, but the demand is so intense that they are forced to do so. At any rate, I'm going to stop here, and we can turn this into questions and answers, and you can ask me as many questions as you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was fascinating, really interesting. Some very interesting themes that came out of that. So guys, for the question and answer section, you'll notice in the, if you click on the participants box, you'll see a raise hand thing. So if you would like to ask a question, please just use the raise hand thing, and I will unmute you and you can ask away. So yeah, if there's anyone who would like to start us off with a question. Don't be shy, guys. Oh, so Juan Pablo, if you just give me a second, I will unmute you. And there we go. Yeah, Juan Pablo, yeah, what's your question?
Okay, hi, my name is Juan Pablo. I am studying government and international relations right now. And it's a little question. Why did you say that it should be allocated the resources in engineering and not in business and administration?
Your question was, why should the government do what?
You say that it's better to allocate resources in engineering and this kind of hard science. So my question is why? Why in this?
I was referring to the polytechnics, which used to be, quite very good outlets for a lot of students. These were places where you went to learn to be a good carpenter, a good auto mechanic, and they also had a mechanical engineering, civil engineering. It wasn't for a university degree. They got diplomas, but these were places you went to learn skills. We would call hand jobs. Things you do with your hands. Now, and what I'm suggesting is that when the polytechnics were turned into universities, rather than continue in the direction which they were already going, that is teaching students these vocational and technical skills, once they became universities, they started emulating what the universities did. And one of the first programs all of them established was business administration. And the result was that now they are providing a lot of degrees in business administration, and not as many in what actually could have a good impact on the economy. Right now, if you go to Ghana, you have a lot of students who have taken degrees in marketing from these polytechnics and have no jobs. And you don't have as many students going in to learn how to be good carpenters, learning how to be good mechanical or automobile engineering, or going to be in building construction. So the misallocation of resources comes from the fact that sometimes governments provide resources for the kind of education which does not lead to a good impact, a big impact on the gross domestic product. And the Polytechnics is a clear case of the government, I believe, misallocating resources. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Yeah, actually, this sounds quite, I don't think this is just an issue in the developing world. It sounds familiar in the United Kingdom also, having similar sort of discussions around this.
From the United Kingdom.
Yeah. Let the bad things as well. So next question will be from Emmanuel. Emmanuel?
Thank you very much. Sam, thank you for...
I know you.
Sam, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I just want you to clarify for me, the difference between the use of educational certificates for signaling as opposed to rationing. In the bigger picture of things, is there really a difference between those two? And if so, can you please clarify that for me? Thank you very much. Again, thanks for the very interesting presentation.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Well, rationing is simply a way of using the education to limit the number of people who can actually get into, if you like, the job market as qualified people to do a certain job. Where there are not enough vacancies, for example, in the civil service, what you want to do is to ration the number of people who will be ready to apply for the position in the first place. Now, signaling actually is a way of showing yourself becoming visible. So how do I get the attention of the employer? And the way I get the attention of the employees is by basically raising my hand so that I can be recognized. And then in the marketplace of jobs, where there are too many people looking for the jobs. Yes, you're right. The signaling and the transfer seem to work the same way, but the signaling actually is the highly educated you are, the more likely you are to be selected for the job. All right. So the rationing actually prevents you from getting to the point where you have the qualification. The signaling is a way to raise your hand. So if you have a PhD in English or a PhD in education, you are better. And I don't want somebody who has just a bachelor's degree. But then I don't let everybody get the PhD in education and ration it by, essentially putting a roadblock to prevent that many people from going. And as a result of that, you essentially make the demand even more intense. People want it, and the pressure can sometimes force the government to cave in and provide more education than is needed.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel, for your question. The next question will come from Petros. Petros, I'll just unmute you. Go ahead, Petros.
Thank you, Professor. Enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Enlightening. I just retired after 40 years of teaching at Kettering University in Flint, Michigan. And it's a highly technical school. And of all the things that you talked about, one of the things that I believe is a balance issue. And sorry for the telephone here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
the balance. Yes. The way our school works is 90% engineering, and the rest of it is divided between science and business. So the way the school works is that our students go to school for 3 months, start in the freshman year, and they go and work for companies of their fields, whether they be mechanical, electrical, industrial, and then the companies interview them and hire them. Mm-hmm. They go back and forth. After 5 years, they earn bachelor's degree, which is accredited in their choice of discipline. Now, the whole idea there is they're not only educated, but they can produce things, okay? Because that's very important. You need both. You need people to do research. That's very important. But there's imbalances. And we're finding right now, companies are clamoring for students like ours that can apply the theory to production systems. And they are throughout the United States and doing that. So when I see this, I think the allocation of resources, as you mentioned, in our governments, specifically in Africa, is a balance, because we need both, okay? Because one of the disheartening things for me to see is that we buy, for example, earth moving equipment to our countries, but there's no one there to repair them. So for me, I'm not an economist and I don't understand all the implications, but overall, I see the balance and the balance that is needed to produce the goods and services. So that's my take on it. I don't know what you think.
You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And actually, this is the point, I believe, which Chang, the Cambridge economist, I think tries to make. You don't need as many research people as you need the people who would apply the research.
Exactly.
Right. And the universities are basically meant for people to do research, high cognitive abilities to do the abstract thinking, provide the theories.
Sure.
But you need the mechanics. You need the technicians.
Absolutely.
And you are right. These are the people who do things. These are the people who prepare things. Right. They don't necessarily have to come up with a new thing, but whatever comes in, they need to be able to prepare. And actually, that is what the polytechnics were intended to do. Yeah. And you are correct. It's an imbalance in the allocation of resources. And actually, if you look at the rates of return, I think it's the argument is forceful enough. Mm-hmm. If primary and secondary education provide higher rates of return for the society, then that is where the bulk of the resources should go. All right. How many university educated people do you need in an economy? And a little bit back to Shang's argument, the Cambridge economist. At the time, he argues that at the time, countries like Switzerland, even the United States and the UK were developing and became developed. They did not have as many university graduates as some of the African countries now have. So the pressure to provide some of these educations which have lower rates of return are probably not dictated by sound economics, but by some forces which governments appear not to be able to stop. That was a very good comment. Thank you very much.
I just want to add one thing that might make you laugh. Last time when I visited home, I'm from Eritrea, East Africa. I've been working with the university there from time to time. So anyway, in this local newspaper, because everybody is pushed to get advanced degrees at the universities. The problem is when they leave, as you articulated, they don't have jobs. So the scene in this article or the newspaper was, there was a funeral going by, and then the two bystanders were looking at each other and they were trying to figure out what this person die of. And so they asked one of the participants, what happened to this person? Why did they die? And the answer was, they have been waiting for office work for years and they died because they have the university degree, but they can't find a job. So they died waiting to get a job. That pretty much summarized it for me when I saw that cartoon. So that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Petros. Any other questions, guys?
Actually, I'd like to ask you a question. Sorry, I can't
Sure,
raise my hand as I'm one of the hosts.
Yeah.
Once again, I'm sure as everyone has already said, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting talk. And I was just interested where you mentioned there about people assuming the costs for their own tertiary education. now that we've seen kind of, and especially, you know, in the days of the pandemic, this growth in MOOCs and open access courses, I just wondered whether you've seen kind of that having much of an effect already, or whether you think it might be an important element kind of as we rethink the structure of education.
It probably would. Actually, off the top, the infrastructure needs are now going to be different. Remote learning in some ways lowers the cost of providing the education. Nobody's saying that university education should not be provided, but all we are saying is that the cost of providing it appears to be out of proportion to the return on it. So if we can lower the cost so that the return on it becomes positive or higher, then absolutely we should encourage more of it. So the answer to your question would probably be that yes, to the extent that the pandemic has made us all very comfortable with remote learning, and we can all do remote learning after work or in places where we cannot provide the infrastructure for the full-blown accessories, we should encourage it. I can imagine several developing countries who cannot provide university education in their places, taking advantage of university education through remote learning. So I can see that accelerating it, but making it easier. Yes, you're correct. I agree with you.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to take a liberty. I have a question. It's just about the fact that you spoke about governments investing more, particularly in the developing world, investing more in tertiary education, when actually, of course, primary and secondary have a better rate of return. What are the causes of that? Because that's the thing here in Colombia also. All of the political discourse is around universities, and very rarely about improving primary schools and secondary schools, which often need much more loving care than the universities. What are the causes of this imbalance?
Well, some have argued that the decision makers themselves are products of these universities, and so it is very easy for them, having seen how far they've come with university education. It's very easy for them to allocate resources for them, but also they want their children to benefit from this type of education, and so even though the data says they should not, in a way they are held hostage by their own success, and they need to ensure that their children also have the same success. Actually, some years ago I was in Ghana, and I was making the same point to some colleagues of mine that look, we should not be spending so much on university education. We should actually be providing more primary education. And the response I got was that, yeah, that is after you have been through it, you want to close the door to the ones who are behind you. After that, you couldn't argue with the person anymore. But there's no simple answer, except that for the policy makers, in a way, are being held hostage to do it. But the good side is that some of these developing countries are now seeing the need for the government to not be in education as much as they used to be, and that is why a lot of private universities have sprung up, especially in Ghana that I'm familiar with, and I think in Nigeria also. You have some very good universities which are now private, and so I hope that trend continues.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Izana, you have a question? I'll I will unmute you.
You are muted.
Sometimes it takes a little time to unmute. Oh, there we go. Izana, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. With several people here, several students, we've had this discussion a few weeks ago about why do you go to university? And the response that a lot of people have here is very similar to what I heard growing up in Africa. And the response is very simple. It seems to be very standardized, is I want to help my country. And so I've always opened this conversation idea to them and asked them, aren't there other things you could do other than going to university to help your country? What's your response to that, Professor?
we should all admit that in the African countries, especially actually throughout, especially in Africa, and because I know this from Ghana and some other places, there's some prestige attached to going to university. A lot of people go to universities not necessarily knowing what they want to go and major in, but I mean the university, and in and of itself, that is enough of an impetus for people to go to the university. But I think we should begin at the elementary school and the primary school to educate the students to see the benefit of having the opportunities that can be available to them from not necessarily going to university, but doing something else. Here in the US, plumbers make a lot more than some college professors. Carpenters make a lot more than some college professors. And if you go to a 2-year college or you learn a trade, nobody sees it as any less prestigious than going to a university. So I think as a society, we especially in the African countries, we need to begin to educate people to realize that there's a lot of prestige, or you can do very well by not necessarily going to university, but by getting a trade job. And I think that could help. At the very early stages, I had some friends who went to the polytechnics and graduated as plumbers. They were very good plumbers, and they do very well. But at this point in time, if you go to Ghana, everybody in secondary school wants to go to a university. And it doesn't matter whether they know what they want to do or what they don't want to do. They want to go to university because that is the path that has been laid out for them. By the way, a lot of the secondary schools are what one might call grammar school. Essentially, they are preparing you to go to the university. And so sometimes after you finish the Form 5 or process or whatever, if you're unable to go to the university, sometimes it's very difficult for you to go do something else. But I think a lot could be done by re-educating students or starting to make them aware of some other lucrative avenues other than the university. But Professor Izan, I mean, you know as much as I do, so I would love to hear what you think about what you think the solution ought to be.
You put me on the spot.
I'm sorry.
Well, my response to the students when they asked me, I don't know if some of them are here, was asked me why I went to university. And my response was, to be that's what I was formed to do.
Exactly.
Well, growing up, I was told that university is going to open doors, and it definitely did.
Yeah.
And, if you're from a developing country originally, it does. In your case, and, it opens doors to go, it opens social capital.
Right.
So that can't be denied. But to what extent do you think that could be applied to a population en masse? And I think it's what you were saying. Well, the developed countries have a large technically trained population. And I guess the question that comes up is, to what extent does, and what you're saying here is, to what extent does higher education generate capital? I think in Africa, higher education and universities had a lot to do with state formation. If you look at the case of, Kwame Nkrumah and in Ghana and parts of in East Africa, all the first universities initially were public universities, and they were created to generate a new cadre that will form a state. So I think that aspect is also very important.
Right.
Compared to Africa, compared to Latin America, here there was a land holding elite from the colonial period. So land was the main part of capital or social capital. I think in the case of Africa, it was education or the bureaucracy, the military or higher education. That's what created this new elite. So I guess it also depends.
Right. I totally agree with you. I mean, when I was growing up, if you went to the university and you graduated, it immediately put you in the upper class. And as you say, in Latin America, if you had land, yes, it put you in the upper class. And without those examples, or with those examples, the tendency was for everybody to want to go to university so I could be part of the upper middle class and do better. Yes. And so now that we all realize that one could achieve that lifestyle without necessarily going to university, I think it's up to us all as educators to begin to educate, especially our children and the children in primary and secondary schools, that look, you could do just as well by being a farmer, or by being a mechanic, or by being a carpenter. And I think that lesson has not yet been transmitted successfully to the primary and secondary school students.
Okay, I think we have time for another question. Petros, could you, I'll just unmute you. Have you got another question? Yeah.
Yes. Professor, you're on target in what you're saying. I think if you look here at the United States, in general, no job is stigmatized, okay?
Nope.
The saying goes, there are no bad jobs, just bad people. So when I look around me, even though I have more education, as you as you talked about earlier, there are people that have associate's degree that are plumbers, that are carpenters, making 1.5 times as much as I do. Okay. But it's not stigmatized. There are people who lawns makes thousands of dollars, but our culture pushes this prestige. And so they push their children, they push everybody, and many times that's not really what they want to do. A while back, I read an article, I can't remember, this when I was younger. A professor in the United States made a, for some reason, he was trying to figure out the suicide rate among graduate students in the United States. And he found that most of the students that committed suicide at the graduate level in the United States were Indian students. When he dug in, one of the things that he mentioned was that the Indian parents, they want their children to be #1 doctors, #2 engineers. Less than that, they're pretty much abandoned by the family. So this, I think, is some of the societal problems that we have in Africa, I believe. And so we have an exchange program with several German universities. And the German model is that they actually train people, they look at the interests when they get to the high school, and they route them to their aptitude. What are they best at? What is their interest? And you can see Germany, we're a consumer of their products, especially machining, they're top notch because they have people that have interest, that's what they want to do. They don't have to have PhD to do research. So I think it makes a lot of sense of what you said, and it's very interesting. And so that mindset has to change.
Yes. Actually, that is very interesting, the German model versus the British model, which especially those of us in Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Liberia inherited. The emphasis was not on practical education. And you're right, they were trying to provide a cadre of people to man the civil service and the classrooms and so on and so forth. And it was a basic education, yes. It's unfortunate, but yes, I'm familiar with the German model, and I think that is a very good one. Incidentally, the University of Science and Technology in Ghana, in the early stages, started that. Students would go to school for the semester, and in between, they actually had practical training. They actually went out to the field. Unfortunately, as with many good things, it didn't last very long for, I don't know why. But thank you very much for your comments.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think that just about wraps it up. So I'd just like to say, Sam, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really, really interesting. Yeah, I feel like I've learned so much in this hour. So yeah, and thanks for spending your time with us. And yeah, we hope to see you. We hope to see you again.
One of these days, yes. Thank you very much. I was glad, I'm glad for the invitation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And yes, so if you would like to see this again, I think, Phil, we're going to we're going to put this line and the recording of this. So if
yeah,
you would like to
that's
see it
right. I'll
again.
be uploading
But
this
yeah, thanks to everybody.
to YouTube.
Great. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot,
Bye.
everyone. Take care.
Hello. That was really good. It's really interesting.